if you were taught as a dude not about what consent is, but what about success is, about what is conquering, what is achieving, your manliness in life and your lot, and a lot of that focuses on your ability, of course, to be able to find very attractive people to have sex with, and to have sex with many of those attractive people as possible, and then it starts to become an entire game of like, well, how do I have sex with someone? How do I convince them to have sex with me? I mean, obviously, I want to have consensual sex, but if I just, ask them like 20 times in a night, maybe I can wear them down, and maybe I'll lie to my partner and tell them I love them when I don't, just so they'll have sex with me, or maybe I'll get them really drunk, but it's okay because I'm drunk too, or maybe I'll follow someone who's really drunk around and see maybe then at that point if they like me. All of that is absolute and complete bullshit. It's coming from a framework of you're not looking or seeking an enthusiastic partner, you're seeking a If you missed yesterday's show and you maybe were blissfully off the internet for the day, you may have missed the Andrew Callaghan sexual assault revelations that came out. It turns out there wasn't just one or two, there was numerous accusations that had come out, and in a very short amount of time, numerous people, victims of Andrew Callaghan, were coming forward and telling their stories. I would say, or the center victim who's coming forward and telling most of these stories has raised a conversation, which is a conversation that seems to come up a lot, especially when it comes to public figures and their lack of consent with the other parties that they are having sex with, in a variety of ways. Everything from getting explicit consent to getting enthusiastic consent to being in power imbalances, sleeping with their fans, seeking their fans out, being predatory on their fans, being sex pests towards their fans, being sex pests towards their colleagues, being predatory towards their colleagues, being abusive towards their colleagues. Between all of this, a conversation keeps coming up. Well, do you lump everything in together? Do we separate all these things? And the answer is, of course, you separate, and we talk specifically about what's occurring. And some of these things, and I think one of the big reckonings that Me Too had with a lot of people, including myself, is you start to reflect back on your own sexual history and be like, well, was I constantly getting enthusiastic consent from my partners? Was I constantly correct in my assessment? Is it still appropriate if you get consent after someone has previously said that they don't want to consent in the same time frame? How long is that time frame? If it moves or changes, what if that person approaches you to suddenly say that they want to have a consensual sexual experience with you, and this is long after they previously said no? All these kind of questions. It is something that needs to be discussed, clearly, because every single time one of these instances comes up, there's a feeling of confused people in the chat, and not even confused, but I would just say a debate going on in real time without any definitive answers. Some people saying, well, at first it doesn't seem like what happened was that wrong. Maybe one party realized that they didn't want to consent to the activity afterwards, and in the other instance, the person absolutely did want to consent to the activity, or maybe they had previously wanted to consent, but then they changed their mind, or that. What is the case? In the sexual encounter of the first victim of Andrew, at least the one that we found out, I'm not saying in terms of timeline, but the first one that we listened to, they were explaining how they had said no multiple times, and then eventually they got worn down and said yes. That is still a non-consensual sexual experience, that you cannot beg a person to have sex with you. You can't wind them down until they're finally like, I give up, because consent is such a complicated thing. Consent, yes, no means no. If someone tells you no, that's all there is to it. They've said no, they don't want to participate in it. But I'm saying from the other end, how many times is you as a person, when someone's asked you for something, and this that you may or may not want to do with them, doesn't have to be sexual, could be anything, have you, instead of just being like, no, and no means no, or have you instead made an excuse? Or have you instead kind of sidetracked, or maybe tried to change the topic? Or have you instead been like, yeah, think about that. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I don't know if I want to loan you my car that I just bought for the weekend, because you're, kind of someone who drives drunk a lot, but we'll see. Okay, I'll think about it. Let me think on that one, right? It's a lot more common to respond in that way. It's very rare that you just, in any situation, will suddenly just be like, no, I do not consent to what you are asking, and no means no, and this is it. We are now done with this conversation. And then the other party is left being like, oh, okay, well, all right, that's it. We have a definitive moment in time. Add into that, these are sexual experiences, or in some cases, moments when people are contemplating sexual activity, maybe not all forms of sex, but certain forms of sexual activity, once again, adding even more complication to the way people are going to communicate with each other. Because the key to all this, as I'm sure you'll discover from an amazing video that I brought on the topic, is communication, open communication, being transparent, as well as informing and understanding how there are new dynamics in the way that people both interact with each other and should interact with each other. If you missed the Andrew Callaghan allegations, these are summaries of them. This has been put to the very top of the Channel 5 Reddit thread. So this is the collection that they are now presenting as in, we're going to be transparent. Here is the collection of them. On January 5th, TikTok user @cornbrasserole posted TikTok accusing Andrew of sexual coercion, sexual assault on March 2021 in St. Petersburg. She doesn't talk much about the relationship prior to this, but just says she liked him, thought he was cool, wanted to be friends. That night, while the two of them were at a dive bar, Andrew said he was falling out with his crew members and needed a place to stay for the night. She said that she let him sleep at her place, but she made it clear that she didn't want anything sexual to happen between them. However, at one point during the night, he gets into her bed and begins repeatedly asking for sex, not taking no for an answer. Eventually, she finally says yes, or describes it as he wore me down. It was fight or flight, and I couldn't control my body anymore, and I froze. She also states while both were drunk that night, Andrew seemed to be purposely trying to get her overtly drunk and brought her a lot of tequila while at the dive bar. She tried to come out with the story earlier, but Andrew texted her and said it would ruin his life if she did come out. He also apparently texted her his own completely different view of that night, which is obviously very frustrating to read after such a traumatic event. In later TikTok evidence, she has been seen with Andrew. She posted pics of them together. She also uses a screenshot of the Insta DMs. She posts a bunch of accusatory DMs she's collected from about 10 different people, and that others have felt comfortable coming out to her. The other stories that came out afterwards. A couple days later, another woman, MoldyFreckle, posted on her video on TikTok. Her story starts on January 29th, 2019, and that's when she first DM'd Andrew, thinking that he was cute, and he responded. From there, she would meet up with Andrew occasionally for sex, but only when she was extremely drunk. After knowing him for a bit, she began to feel Andrew gave off bad vibes, being mean and sexually demanding. One day, when Andrew again messaged her to hang out, she refused, explaining she didn't like the type of person he was. Andrew said he wanted to apologize, so she reluctantly accepted a date. On that date, he proceeds to barely apologize and continuously asks her to have sex with him in the car. When she refuses, he then asks for the drive home. She accepts, but once in the car, he sexually harasses her, kissing her without consent, grabbing her thigh and body tightly, and even pulling his hand down her shorts without consent. He also refused to leave the car when she asked him to, forcing her to drive out of fear, although she never mentions this in the video. In one comment, she also mentions she had to physically kick Andrew at one point to get him off her. She posts various pics of her DMs, later as proof of their interactions. After these stories, allegations surfaced that were never taken seriously and or never gained traction from 2021 and 2020. So years of testimony worth coming out. In August 2021, an Instagram story from an account said her friend was sexually harassed by Andrew. This was later revealed to be actually an early reporting of Cornbrasserole's assault after the Reddit thread surfaced. In this Reddit thread, she confirmed her Reddit account was the one posted in the original 2021 Insta story, sharing the screenshot of said Instagram page. But notice the screenshot of the account shows the ability to leave a note, something you can only do if you're signed into the account yourself. Then in a private DM to me, she confirms her allegations were in reference to Cornbrasserole. In the Reddit thread, she goes in more depth about her experience. She says after that night, the assault occurred, called her bawling her eyes out, and essentially told her the exact same story that she revealed in the TikTok in the coming out video. After originally posting the allegations on the Insta account, Cornbread's friend also received DMs and was posted on the story, keeping the DMers anonymous. One DM she posts is from someone who states that she's known Andrew for a long time, and he's done similar things to at least 3 other girls, all in different cities, most underage. Another DM reveals someone who is apparently and has been working with the victims of Andrew's behavior for some time. He states that Andrew's predatory behavior is known by some people in Florida, specifically referencing someone who told him that there's a victim that Andrew did something similar to in St. Pete. He proceeds to mention 2 of his friends in New Orleans, mentioned Andrew got kicked out of whatever scene there was. They were there for being a creep, and also got a random DM from a victim telling him they know that he's done similar behavior to unnamed victims in Tennessee and Washington. In terms of total DMs, Cornbread's friends said she had gotten 5 to 10 women in 24 hours and at least 2 underage in 3 different states across the Southeast coming forward against Andrew. In 2020, a woman revealed that Andrew attempted to sexually prey on one of her friends who was very drunk. Despite the inebriation, this girl was in a state of mind to say no to Andrew, but he continued pestering them for sex. After posting his story online, the original poster got a DM from a woman saying Andrew raped one girl she knew when he was acting creepy with a bunch of others. She also states he aggressively pursued the DM when they were 17 and came onto her multiple times, even though she said no. He invited her back to his place and apparently attempted to follow the girl with her friend home in the dark. The last big story was posted on January 7th and takes place in New Orleans in late 2019 and early 2020. A friend of MoldyFreckle came forward and spoke about his own partner's interaction with Andrew while she was 17 in college and Andrew was 22. She described how she and friends went to hang out with him one day. He took them to a local abandoned Navy base, which was known to be a fun place to explore and do graffiti. During the hangout, he acted oddly possessive over her, grabbing her all day and trying to isolate her from the small friend group. The group decided they didn't like his weird behavior and took an Uber to a bar. Andrew followed them to the Uber in the same bar and kept ordering her shots, and then later pulled out a 17-year-old around the corner and forcibly tried to make out with her until her roommate came over and intervened. They got her to get away from him, and the girl kept repeating she had a boyfriend. Andrew responded, "It's cool. I have long-distance girlfriends. We are open. Do you want to have a threesome with us when she comes into town next week?" and kept her in the corner pushing on her until the roommate's boyfriend went over and tried to fight them. They broke away and just the two walked home, but he eventually followed halfway to the dorms until they literally started sprinting away. There's a bunch of other complaints, allegations, and then references in random DMs in people's threads of I have another story that hasn't been mentioned, or I know another person who hasn't come forward about that. But yeah, it is an overwhelming amount of stories. It seems from every single person who's come forward to talk about this that he has just a long history of being an incredibly aggressive abuser, creep, sexual assaulter, and someone who targets minors as well. It's pretty much as horrifying as a rap sheet can get in terms of someone accused of multiple sexual assaults, and it's very, very bad, very incredibly bad. Most, if not everyone I've seen come out to talk about this who was previously a fan of Andrew has pretty much condemned everything. I think even the most hardline fans at this point are probably like, yeah, I'm gonna wait to see what his statement is, gonna wait to see what happens next. But obviously this is pretty disturbing. So I want to quickly play this video by Hannah Witton. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hannah. I'm going to subscribe and not be a hypocrite. But this has multiple descriptions of consent and discusses consent in a far more complex way than I was used to, especially when I was a wee lad. So I was watching this earlier today, and it was an absolutely fascinating, also awesome video, very well produced. Would highly recommend this content creator. So let's all learn together for 2 seconds.
Hello everyone. So this week is Sexual Health Week. I know we just had World Sexual Health Day, now it's Sexual Health Week. We're just making all of the content about all of the sexual health days. It's because I got that calendar, so I know when things are happening now. Sexual Health Week in the UK is run by Brooke, who I'm an ambassador for. They are a young person's sexual health charity, and the theme this year is consent. Now, I could have done a whole video about just like the do's and don'ts of consent, but instead, one of the things that I have been coming across a lot recently, and also just been thinking about more generally recently, is how our understanding of consent has evolved. You'd think that consent was just consent, right? But no, we just have to go and make it more complicated. No, I don't think it's more complicated. I think as our understanding has evolved, it's actually made things clearer. So in this video, I want to take us on a journey through a few.
I learned about consent from the old YouTube video about tea. So think of the old tea video as our consent 101. Now we're going to go straight to 302. So we're going to go a little bit more advanced, but it's going to be far more fascinating, and I would say far more rewarding.
Different models of consent, how they work, what they mean, what its strengths are, what its pitfalls are, and why we have maybe evolved into new understandings of consent. For the most part, I'll be using gender neutral language in this video. However, we can't talk about consent without talking about rape culture, and we can't talk about rape culture without acknowledging how gendered it is, with the majority of perpetrators being men and the majority of victims and survivors being women. Of course, we should be supporting all survivors of sexual violence, whatever their gender and the gender of their perpetrator, and at the same time making sure we don't forget to address sexism and misogyny. I'll leave some links in the description to some resources and support around sexual abuse and violence for men, women, and non-binary folks. So, our first model of consent is no means no. This phrase was
And this is the one everyone knows. Yes.
coined by the women's movement in the 1970s, and it was used in many rape prevention campaigns. And you may recognize it if you ever experienced sex ed in school. No means no, kids. So no means no is about the responsibility to listen to and respect a no when you hear one. It's also about the responsibility to say no if you don't want the sex. However, how easy is it to say no? And here it's really important to think about how acceptable or not acceptable it is to say a direct no in our culture, even in non-sexual situations. Somebody asks you if you want to do something. Do you tell them no directly, or do you come up with an excuse, or do you say you're busy, or do you lie, or do you go along with it anyway even if you don't want to? Saying no in our culture is not normalized at all. It is so difficult to say no just to like a social hang that maybe you don't want to go on, or a party that you don't want to go to. So how easy do you think it is to say no in sexual situations? Sex is incredibly vulnerable, and often people don't have the confidence to say no, or they might feel like they don't have the right to say no. Marital rape was legal in the UK until the early 1990s. You legally couldn't say no to your spouse. Within a no means no consent model, perpetrators can use the excuse of, well, she didn't say no. And essentially, consent is presumed unless it is withdrawn. So, whilst no means no did some great work, and I mean, it was my understanding of consent as a teenager and young adult for a long time, it definitely isn't enough to actually deal with the reality of how people interact with each other, and specifically power dynamics in sexual relationships as well. And that brings us on to affirmative consent.
And by the way, moving on from that very first point, two takeaways. One, that's one of the reasons why it's always really disturbed me when people try to go after victims who have been like, well, here's, you know, my tweet longer story, and here's the entire thing that I've talked about, and then be like, well, it sounds as if this person was either putting themselves in a pretty vulnerable position by going home with the guy or having a guy go home with her. So, I mean, at that point, what's going on? And also, it kind of seems at a certain point you also said like you were into this, or you said yes, or what's going on. So why are you actually making like an accusation video about this afterwards? Second point being, with this, that doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form, she's not implying that no means no suddenly means something else. She's saying, yes, no means no, and there's more to this too. If someone says no, that's no. But that's not going to be enough of a tool set in terms of kind to navigate so many complex issues that surround this, such as what happens if you have sex with a sex worker? Has the sex worker consented? Is that a no means no because the sex worker says yes? What does this mean? Is there more complex variety to what exactly this is going to have in terms of our interaction together?
This emerged in the 1990s, and if the previous one was no means no, then affirmative consent is yes means yes. Affirmative consent means that the absence of a no is not enough, and the absence of a no does not indicate consent. The focus here is on the yes, whether that's a verbal or a non-verbal agreement to sex. The affirmative consent model leads to women's role in sex not just being one of potential refusal, and this model was very much adopted by universities in their consent policies and by the law. However, is affirmative consent enough? It frames sex as something that one person wants and the other person either accepts their offer or refuses it. And in the case of heterosexual relationships, very much the man that offers and the woman whose responsibility it is to accept or refuse. Do you want sex? Yes or no, and those are your only options. Many people, especially women and other marginalized genders, agree to sex or consent to sex that they do not want because they feel like they have no other choice. And this is often down to an inequality of power in relationships in regards to gender, but it's also exacerbated by other marginalized identities that people may hold, such as trans status, sexuality, disability, immigration status, race, and class. So where do we go from affirmative consent? Well, welcome to the party, enthusiastic consent. This is very much a level up. We've evolved. This is not just about agreeing to sex that was somebody else's idea, but sex being something that you are excited about and you are enthusiastic about engaging in. The focus with enthusiastic consent is about mutual pleasure and desire, which is amazing. And this model is very much championed within the sex positive movement. However, we can't ignore all of the people who are consenting to sex that they don't sexually desire. The model of enthusiastic consent can fall into the trap of labeling all non-enthusiastic consent as non-consent and therefore rape. For example, there are a lot of people that consent to sex that they don't enthusiastically desire in the way that we would expect from enthusiastic consent, in that they are sexually aroused and feeling sexual desire and really horny and turned on. That could include people like sex workers, asexual people, and from personal experience, people trying to get pregnant. Sexual desire, enthusiasm for sex.
Yeah, so if you're in my age group where like a lot of your friends are already having kids or have had kids, that is a very frequent story where it's like, oh yeah, I was like, oh, so I mean, that must be fun. At least before you had the kid, you got to have unbelievable quantities of sex, right? It's like, well, yeah, a lot of it was very mechanical. But let me put it like that. Yes, it was very much, yes, I will now achieve an erection and I will now inseminate, because we have to do it sometimes, multiple times, at certain points at exact times, because it's like, I'm now ovulating in this very short window and I would like us to proceed with this. And you're like, oh, I didn't know this was, okay, well, this is happening, right? I was, okay, let's have this. That doesn't mean that the sex is unconsensual on either side. Both sides are consenting to that activity of sex, even if they aren't deriving an enormous amount of pleasure from it, or even if it is quite mechanical and being done in such a way where it's like, okay, now you need to angle yourself because apparently you'll have a higher rate of insemination if you get at that like certain degree. All right, now hold on, okay, stay still, or stuff like that, right? But both parties are consenting to the activity.
Seeking pleasure are not the only reasons that people may want to have sex. Research done in 2007 found 237 reasons why people wanted to have sex. And I'm just going to read a few of them for you because we're not going to get through the whole list. I was in the heat of the moment. It just happened. I was bored. It just seemed like the thing to do. Someone dared me. I desired emotional closeness. I wanted to feel closer to God. I wanted to gain acceptance from my friends. It's exciting.
Wait, I wanted to feel closer to God. Wow, amazing. I hope your partner delivered. Yeah.
Adventurous. I wanted to make up after a fight. I wanted to get rid of aggression. I was under the influence of drugs. I wanted to have something to tell my friends. I wanted to express my love for the person. I wanted to experience the physical pleasure. I wanted to show my affection to the person. I felt like I owed it to the person. I was attracted to the person. I was sexually aroused and wanted the release. My friends were having sex and I wanted to fit in. It feels good. My partner kept insisting. The person was famous and I wanted to be able to say I had sex with them. I wanted the person to love me. I wanted to have a child. I wanted to make someone else jealous. I wanted to have more sex than my friends. I was married and you're supposed to. I was tired of being a virgin. I was horny. I wanted to feel loved. I was feeling lonely. Everyone else was having sex. I wanted the attention. There's just a taster. I'll leave a link in the description to this entire list so you can have a peruse for yourself. And I know I mentioned a quote from this book in my last video, but honestly, it's just full of so many good nuggets. Here's something that Catherine Angel said in Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again that I think is really important. If consenting to sex must also involve desire or enthusiasm, the implication is that those consenting to sex without desire, sex workers for example, have not really consented. This makes the overriding of their agreement, their assault, meaningless, which in turn makes the protection of sex workers difficult. So here's the thing, enthusiastic consent is great. And in a lot of sexual encounters, it should absolutely be the thing that we are striving for. But it becomes messy if we try and apply it as a universal standard of consent. So what's next? Entering the ring, we have authentic consent. This is a framework developed by sex educator Dr. Nadine Thornhill. I'll leave links to her work and her social media in the description. She is amazing. This is a framework for consent that I first came across on her Instagram, and I'm just going to read what she said about it. Authentic sexual consent is an agreement that is motivated by people's sincere desire to have sex for reasons that may include, but aren't limited to, pleasure, exploration, generosity, love, baby making, or because it's their job. Authentic consent can be enthusiastic. It can also be optimistically awkward, a means to an end, or entirely transactional. But at its foundation, it's always about folks agreeing to have sex because it's what they want. I love this framework, especially because it leads me to thinking about sexual authenticity more generally. We're given a very small box of what kind of sexual desire, behaviors, and relationships are seen as healthy, normal, and appropriate. But for many people, and I would potentially argue for most or all people, even cis, heterosexual, monogamous, vanilla people, this box is too small and too restrictive, and it doesn't feel authentic to our identities, desires, or experiences. And I would just love to know in the comments, whatever you are happy sharing, what kinds of sexual relationships or behaviors feel authentic to you.
Okay, so if you've not been confused yet, and you've been like, this is all super fascinating, super interesting, because that's where I was at, was I was like watching this for the first time. I was like, oh, wow, okay, this is, I love seeing the layers of complexity to this topic, because it is a very serious and often difficult topic to talk about, and being done in such an informative way. And like I said, that was 302 level, but now we're gonna get to the graduating 401. This is needed for your dissertation kind of shit.
You. So I want now to take us beyond consent and to think of different ways of giving and receiving and going about our sexual relationships. Let me introduce to you Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent. So this is Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent. Betty Martin is a sexologist and intimacy coach, and she has put tons of free resources about the Wheel of Consent online if you want to look deeper into it. This is just going to be my very...
Move over political compass, yeah. And by the way, none of this is that like, so when you and your partner are in a room together and suddenly it seems like there's some spark in the air, well, that's the moment to bring out the Wheel of Consent. No, that's not what this is. This is all conceptual, but this is for you to understand that there are different forms of sex that are done between people or sexual activity, such as you can perform cunnilingus, aka you can eat the pussy, or someone can perform cunnilingus on you, aka suck the cock. Things like this can happen, but is there a giving, a receiving? Are you receiving pleasure from the act itself? Are you giving and giving someone else pleasure? And understanding the concepts between how those differentiate in different forms of consent.
Quick and dirty interpretation. So with the Wheel of Consent, you've got your 2 axes and your 4 quadrants. This axis is about action. You've got the doer and you've got the done to. And this axis is about pleasure. You've got the giver and the receiver. And so the relationship dynamics work in these directions. So if you are the doer and you are the giver, then you are doing something for someone else's pleasure, and that is called the serve category. On the other side, if you are the receiver and the done to, then you are accepting something from someone else for your own pleasure, and that is the accept quadrant. On this side, if you are the doer and the receiver, then you are doing something to someone else for your own pleasure, and you are then in the take quadrant. And on the other side of that, if you are the giver and the done to, then you are allowing someone else to do something to you for their pleasure. Does that make sense? So each of these quadrants are different forms of consent, and one of my favorite things about the Wheel of Consent is how hot and sexy it can be if you just focus on which quadrant you are in. So rather than with every single thing that you do during sex being like, oh, making sure that I'm getting pleasure from it, making sure that they're getting pleasure from it, making sure that everyone is happy, which can work, but instead if you try something like this where you're like, for this 15 minutes, it's about my pleasure and I want to do this. Or for this 15 minutes, it's about your pleasure and I'm going to do this. Like if you focus in on one of these, So yes, links in the description if you want to find more info about the Wheel of Consent, and also Betty Martin has a book called The Art of Receiving and Giving. An idea that I came across recently is ethical sex. So consensual sex is legal sex, and non-consensual sex is illegal sex and should probably not even be called sex because it is rape or sexual assault. Consent is the requirement for something to even be sex, but we can have consensual bad sex. And so what we want is good sex. And everyone's definition of good sex will be different depending on what you're into, but some of the general foundations for it are trust and respect, great communication, feeling safe physically, emotionally, and safe to express yourself and be vulnerable, feeling present and connected, having fun and experiencing pleasure, and compatibility and shared values. Are you into the same things, and does sex mean the same thing to you as the other person or people? Dr. Chris Donahue, who is a sex therapist, talks about ethical sex in his book Rebel Love, and he says that good sex is ethical sex. So what is ethical sex? He says that ethical sex and relationships is about an awareness that we are relational beings, and that our interactions, however big or small, can have an impact on somebody else, however big or small. So it's about focusing on how what you do and what you say can leave an impact on others and trying to leave a positive impact. And then it's also about checking in with how you feel before, during, and after sex. Do I feel good about it, or does this sex make me feel bad? Should I be having this kind of sex? Should I be having sex with this person? How does it make you feel? And ultimately, it's about compassion for other people, whether they're a long-term partner or a one-night stand. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of these different
I'm going to share this video, obviously, because it was fucking awesome. I thought it was really descriptive. It was way more complex in terms of exploring the idea of consent, but also understanding that there are still general rules that determine whether or not something is consensual or not. Obviously, the no means no means no. That framework doesn't change. However, the ideas of suddenly, well, what if you had unpleasurable sex, but you still wanted to have sex with that person? What if you never had an orgasm? What if you never, achieved an erection during that experience? Does that mean that all of a sudden that was a non-consensual sexual experience, even if it wasn't pleasurable? Well, yeah, no, it doesn't. You can still have consensual bad sex that can occur. You can always have consensual mechanical sex, like when some couples have to try very difficult maneuvers in order to try and, have impregnation due to infertility problems or stuff like that. Like if you've, like, what is it, when people do in vitro fertilization, women have to undergo, and non-binary people who can give birth undergo just like intensive, like needles and needles and needles worth of shots, and that does not in any way seem sexy or pleasurable. And then, shortly thereafter be like, all right, now we're going to have to engage in a sexual experience because, it's about fertilization. So again, they can range all across the board in terms, but like understanding the differences and also the complexities of this topic, I think is fascinating. Something that should be talked about more than simply, the T video, which is of course an easy 101 quick metaphor for people to try and understand the differences between things like consent. It doesn't really speak about the idea of, it basically gets into very light ideas of enthusiastic consent, and doesn't talk about authentic consent and all those other kind of things. But so please, if you like this content, go follow this content creator. That's Hannah Witton. She has a lot of topics, obviously 18 plus only, or 19 plus, depending on what the law is in your generic region, because a lot of it does deal with, pretty advanced concepts of sex and sexual activity. In terms of the narrative and going forward with this kind of stuff, everything in the realm of when we were talking about Andrew Callaghan, and broadly speaking, because this is not an Andrew Callaghan story uniquely. I mean, Andrew Callaghan, darling superstar of the left, and then we've got Andrew Tate, darling superstar of the far right, both being accused of a lot of horrifying things. A lot of that goes back to, broadly speaking, the way a lot of this bullshit is reinforced in society, and again and again and again. If you were taught as a dude not about what consent is, but what about success is, about what is conquering, what is achieving your manliness in life and your lot, and a lot of that focuses on your ability, of course, to be able to find very attractive people to have sex with, with, and to have sex with many of those attractive people as possible. And then it starts to become an entire game of like, well, how do I have sex with someone? How do I convince them to have sex with me? I mean, obviously I want to have consensual sex, but if I just, ask them like 20 times in a night, maybe I can wear them down, and maybe I'll lie to my partner and tell them I love them when I don't, just so they'll have sex with me. Or maybe I'll get them really drunk, but it's okay because I'm drunk too. Or maybe I'll follow someone who's really drunk around and see maybe then at that point if they like me. All of that is absolute and complete bullshit, and it's coming from a framework of you're not looking or seeking an enthusiastic partner, you're seeking a fuck. Right? You're not seeking to have another person to have sex with that enthusiastically wants to have sex with you too. You're seeking people to have sex with, and that's it. That's the only thing that you're looking for. And unfortunately, that is reinforced, broadly speaking, within society as part of the entire terrible side of negative masculinity. That's reinforced over and over and over. You're only good if you're a breadwinner, if you're a conqueror, if you can really smash as many people as possible. All that kind of shit. I'm just telling you that your success will be based on these things. And yeah, okay, we're gonna put you out into the world where now people start to have this vision of like, well, yeah, what if I just ask 6 times in a night and finally I wear her down? I did it. I had the sex having. But it's not you're looking for someone who enthusiastically, again, wants to have sex with you. That should be the goal in terms of sexual activity. You should be seeking out a partner who also enthusiastically wants to have sex with you in both ends. Not this power dynamic where if it's a man and a woman and it's like, well, the man has to decide, or sorry, the woman has to decide when the holy gates of sex will occur and then open up. No, both partners enthusiastically want to have sex with each other. And then, of course, you can figure out through the process what you are and are not comfortable in within a framework of, ask before doing is a very easy general rule. Ask before trying some new thing that the other person might not like on the spot, and that goes both ways. I think I need therapy, you men and women. But all those same rules apply to relationships between two women, two men, between non-binary people as well. A lot of the same rules would apply regardless of the situation. There's just already gendered differences and skewings of statistics in one direction, which is why you have to mention that there are differences between the way these things replicate in statistics.
Do you enjoy the Serfs but prefer not to have to use your eyeballs? Many are saying this. Well, we've got the solution for you. It's the Serf Times in podcast form, available on most major podcasting networks now. If you enjoy it, please consider leaving a good review and feedback because it really helps the show out, apparently, and it's free, just like the podcast.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Juste, we shall spend many a generations building mighty cathedrals in your honor. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are but your oafish jesters, here to offer you a laugh at any opportunity. To our brave knights of the Round Table, Rachel K., Izzy Solidarity, Victoria Bell, Sebastian Demel, Mark Harmon, Benji Arney, Scary Earth Human, Tony, DM Rivera, Resident Scarecrow, Sir Nickus, Cheryl Alvarez, Ruby Kelly, Brandon, Words Greenwood, Everything Important, Hegbert Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariane McCarthy, Doug Cady, Daniel Sutton, Jenna Tao, Dark Puppy, Quiet One 85, Anna Loves Riley, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, Multimondi, Trevbot EXE, Brian Ephraim, Anthropophojak, Catherine, Ramon Acosta, Nkosin, Ralph Parler, Violent Orchard, Political Puppy, La Media Panza, Todd Buckingham, and Todd La Jeunesse. We salute our valiant heroes off to fight injustice everywhere.